This is a horror story about a beautiful island. Some things are hard to believe. Therefore, we have put footnotes underneath the video so you can check the facts for yourself. Let's start. In the Indian Ocean lies a beautiful island. The climate is warm, it has mountains, rainforests, beautiful beaches, and a lot of exotic fruits. Some people call it heaven on earth. We know it as Sri Lanka. But for decades, Sri Lanka has been in a war, and a slow genocide is taking place. In 2009, more than 70,000 people, 1/4 of the population in the Vani, were slaughtered. It is seen as an internal conflict between the Tamils in the north and east and the Sinhala in the south and west. But let's zoom out a bit. The internal conflict in Sri Lanka started in the beginning of the 20th century, but the conflict about Sri Lanka by external powers is much older. In the early 1500s, the Portuguese took control over the island. In the mid-1600s, the Dutch took over. At the end of the 1700s, the British threw out the Dutch and their allies, the French. All this has to do with the strategic significance of the island. It lays in the middle of different very important sea lanes. No ship can pass through the major sea route without being observed from the island. And its main port, Trincomalee Harbour, is huge and deep. Already the Portuguese said it was the finest place from which they could control their possessions in the region. In fact, whatever colonial power that is dominant in the region needs to have control over Sri Lanka, or more precisely, over Trincomalee Harbour. When the British, masters of divide and rule, gained control of the island, they fed the Sinhalese with anti-Tamil chauvinism, so that the Sinhalese would be loyal to them. After decades of racism by the Sinhala majority, brutal pogroms and several decades of non-violent protest by the Tamils, which were met with military force, some Tamils took up the arms to defend themselves and their land. This is how the LTTE, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, came into being. While many Tamil men joined the resistance, the Sri Lankan soldiers were ordered by their superiors to rape the Tamil women. Responding to this unbearable situation, and after a deep-seated social revolution, many women joined the armed struggle. The Sinhalese army bought weapons from many different countries, but got guidance from the US and UK. For decades, the US policy of a military solution was supported by the Western Alliance. The increasing involvement of women in the LTTE made the Tamil Tigers powerful enough to reach military parity with the Sri Lankan armed forces. The intensity of the war undermined the Sri Lankan economy, and even the Sinhalese elite became tired of the war. At the same time, the EU countries broke away from the US policy and promoted a peaceful solution. In this background, the Sinhalese elite accepted the peace proposal from the Tamils, which enabled negotiations to start. The Americans were obliged to join the co-chairs of the peace process, and their allies, the Japanese, followed. Throughout the years, different countries have banned the LTTE, listing it as a terrorist organization. In 1997, the US did it. In 1998, the Sri Lankan government. In 2001, the UK followed, just as the peace talks were being planned. However, in 2002, the Sri Lankan government lifted the ban so that negotiations were possible. In 2003, the US were preparing for the Iraq War, and the co-chair countries, who had agreed previously to promote peace in Sri Lanka, split. On one side, the EU wanted peace in Sri Lanka and opposed the war in Iraq. The other, the US and UK, wanted war. The Iraq War focused the minds of the US military to the urgency of having control over Trincomalee Harbour. Diego Garcia was too small. Trincomalee is not only much bigger, but also better located. The US and the UK tried to destroy the peace process in different ways. In 2003, the US forced a very important meeting for the peace process to take place in Washington, where, remember, the LTTE was banned. In protest to the US action, the LTTE left the negotiations, but they maintained the ceasefire agreement with the Sri Lankan government. After the tsunami in December 2004, a huge amount of money was collected from all over the world for the victims of this catastrophe. The EU insisted that the donations should be divided equally among the Sinhala and Tamil population. But the US government obstructed any money reaching the Tamil areas. Moreover, the US secretly visited all the EU countries to convince them to ban the LTTE. EU ambassadors predicted that if the EU would ban the LTTE, this would lead to war. And so it did. 2 months after the EU ban, and after 4 years of peace, the war started again. With as climax the massacre in Mullawaikal, where within a few months between 70,000 and 146,000 Tamils were killed by the Sri Lankan army. The LTTE was wiped out. The remaining population of the Vani, about 300,000 people, was put in internment camps. Although, according to the definition of the United Nations, this massacre is clearly genocide, it has not been recognized by the international community. The genocide is continuing to date by means of forced disappearance, incarceration, torture, rape, land grabbing, and the destruction of Tamil culture. The Tamil tigers have been eliminated. The Tamil population around Trincomalee Harbour has been dramatically reduced. And guess who's getting free access to Trincomalee Harbour? The USA. They can have regular naval exercises in Trincomalee now. For the USA, this is critical for their pivot to Asia policy. The US want to have control in the strategically important region. In this way, they will be able to build a war-based geopolitic to get leverage in their economic fight with the EU. Let's look at the US and the EU now. The US don't have a very strong economy, but they have natural resources, the strongest army in the world, and military bases all over the globe. The EU has a strong economy, especially Germany. They are producing cars, industrial machinery, etc., etc. But to fuel their economy, they need oil, for example from the Middle East, gas, for example from their neighboring country Russia, going through Ukraine, and a network to transport goods to and from China. If the EU countries would utilize Russian gas, and the production and distribution with China would intensify, this would lead to a rapid economic rise of all these three blocs, leaving the US far behind. The US want to prevent this by cutting those relations and creating wars, if necessary genocidal. This is what we call the war paradigm. Way back in 1984, the leader of the LTTE, Velupillai Prabhakaran, stated, "America's objective is not simply confined to helping the Sri Lankan army to crush the Tamil liberation struggle. The ultimate aim is to secure a naval base in Trincomalee. Such a happening will convert the Indian Ocean into a war zone and will increase the tensions prevalent in the area. The Tamil tigers should be recognized for their courage to stand up against the US and its ally the UK. The genocide on the Tamils in Sri Lanka should be internationally acknowledged and stopped. We should build up solidarity between oppressed people all over the globe and fight for peace and justice on this planet."